Hi, welcome to Reflections on Gaming, our weekly space to talk about everything having to do with video games and pop culture in general. I'm Weston.
And I'm Jordan. Last week, we discussed Ratchet & Clank, the series, why we like it, why so many other people like it, and where to find the fun in that game series, and hopefully where it's going. This week, we're going to talk about how to find the fun in RPGs. If you are new to the gaming sphere or have never played a game, that may not be a familiar term to you, but soon it will be. First question, right out of the gate. What is an RPG? What does an RPG stand for? Well, an RPG stands for a role-playing game. The very first iteration, or at least the first really well-known iteration of an RPG, is, of course, D&D, Dungeons & Dragons. And the core idea behind Dungeons & Dragons were you could pretend to be someone else in a far-off land with magic and sorcerers and wizards and all sorts of really cool stuff, and just kind of forget about what you were doing in your day-to-day job, whatever it is that was stressing you out, and you could live out your wildest fantasies in this tabletop RPG.
And the same is true today with video games. Those same types of games that people played on the tabletop not that long ago, but in the 1970s, 1980s, when they were first getting started, made their way into the game realm. One of the very first well-known video game RPGs was a game called Final Fantasy. Kind of broke into the sphere, but just like D&D, you could pretend to be this other person in this other world that could do lots of things that are completely impossible in real life. And just like D&D, even though the first iteration was really popular in its time, over the years, RPGs, both tabletop and in video games, have changed and evolved and developed to far beyond what they used to be.
That's right. This week, we want to focus mainly on RPGs in the video game sense, because they have taken a pretty drastic departure from their tabletop roots and really don't look very similar. The things that make a tabletop RPG are not the same things that make a video game RPG. But if you say to someone who's familiar with it, I want to play an RPG, recommend something to me, they will know immediately what you're talking about and the kinds of things that you're looking for. So, let's talk about what those things are. What is it that makes a video game RPG an RPG? What is it that, lets us define a game as a role-playing game? Because, to be fair, every game you play is a role-playing game. You're given a character, or you create a character, and then you play through the game as if you are that character. But not every game in existence is considered an RPG. And we're going to talk about why that is.
Yeah, there are two main kind of camps that RPGs fall into nowadays. There are action RPGs, which we're not going to talk as much about today. But then there's not really, I can't think of a specific name for them, but there's just like the core role-playing games, which is a little bit more what we're going to talk about today, that encompass things like Pokemon, Final Fantasy, Shin Megami Tensei, games where you are you take the role of a specific person, and usually there is a very strong overarching story. The story is usually a really, really big part of the role-playing game, and generally they focus, the gameplay is, of course, important, and it's there, and if it's not fun, you're not going to have fun with the game. But in general, there's a lot more focus on the story that's being told than the gameplay mechanics that you're working with.
Well, it kind of comes down to the story is part of the fun. If an RPG doesn't have a good story, it will not be remembered the same way that games with excellent stories are. I found kind of 5 core ideas that run through standard RPGs that really help as a game designer, knowing what it is you need to put into your game to make it good and appeal to people who enjoy RPGs, and allow you as a consumer to know what to kind of base your evaluation of this game on. So first, like Weston said, it's a central quest that runs throughout the entire game. There's some big story hook that pulls you in, and sometimes there's multiple hooks, sometimes there's multiple threads that weave and intermingle, sometimes they have false peaks where you think you're coming to this big old critical crescendo, and it turns out that that person you were fighting wasn't actually the big boss, but there was someone behind them. But regardless of that, there is some big main quest that people are following. The second thing, and something that if it is not in your game, it's not an RPG, is the ability to improve your character over the course of the game. And specifically, this tends to be done with leveling. Some games allow you to go from level 1 to 10, some from level 1 to 99, some from 1 to 1,000. The scaling of that system doesn't need to be consistent, but the fact that you have that system does. There's many games that have different types of progression systems, such as skill-based progression in The Witcher 3, and skill-based progression in a lot of action games like Tomb Raider, the newer series, and things like that aren't really what we're talking about when we talk about progressing and improving your character. It really has to do with those statistical leaps and something that happens fairly regularly.
Yeah, in most, I'll use Final Fantasy as an example of this. Most Final Fantasy games have kind of a secondary system that they attach onto those statistical things, but at the core of every single time you level up, the amount of health you have goes up. In most of them, the amount of magical points, or essentially the number of spells that you can cast during a battle, goes up. Perhaps the amount of attacks that will miss you when the enemy attacks you goes up, and just kind of those base stats that make you more powerful of a character without actually needing to do anything at all go up with the levels, and that's something that's pretty core to the RPG genre.
Right, and that ties back to its tabletop roots. When you're playing a tabletop RPG, you have to have a skill sheet that tells you all of your statistical abilities as well as the skills that you can apply, and you add those numbers to a die roll. And based on that total, you'll know whether you succeeded or failed in some kind of skill check, or how much damage you dealt, or how much damage you took, or if you dodged something. So in the video game realm, those numbers are used the same way, but the player is no longer rolling that die, the computer is. On to the next core tenet. So first we've got a big story. Next we have character improvement. The third would be, and this is not always 100% true, but it is like 99% true. The game's combat will involve a menu system. So generally, the character or characters you play as will not move, or you at least will not have control over them. And instead, you will tell them what to do when it's their turn. The way that those turns happen and how quickly they happen and all that stuff can change, but the fact that you say, I want you to attack, or I want you to use this spell, or I want you to use this item in a menu rather than, real-time inputting buttons, is one of the defining features of an RPG.
Interestingly, in recent years, that system has begun to fall out of style a little bit. Games like Persona 5, which is a Japanese game that was imported over to America. It was originally known as Shin Megami Tensei. In like Persona 5, the newer Final Fantasies, a lot of the times you control just one character and you can kind of give commands to other characters, but you just kind of tell them overall what to do, like be aggressive, just keep attacking, or go back and support, and they'll heal the other party members without you telling them specifically what to do, which I think is kind of an interesting shift that has happened over the last 5-10 years.
Yeah, but While the control of the player over his entire party has begun to rescind in recent years, which kind of makes sense, since you couldn't tell your whole party what to do in D&D. You could make some suggestions, but what they did was kind of down to their personal preferences. But the core is still kind of a menu-based system.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. I hadn't thought about that connection to D&D. But anyway, what's the next one?
The next one is the ability to interact with the either environment or the storyline through some kind of additional ability. And this, again, goes back to the tabletop of having skills that are not necessarily combat focused, and you being able to do those things. This is one of the weaker tenets. Not every RPG needs to have this to be an RPG, but it is fairly ubiquitous. There aren't many games that you would consider an RPG that don't have some form of abilities that you can do outside of combat. Sometimes this is as simple as you can interact with the environment to solve some puzzle, which will allow you to either progress the story or find some secret goodies that you wouldn't otherwise receive. But it is... I don't believe I have played an RPG that doesn't have some element of that in it.
To give an example of kind of what Jordan is talking about right now, Pokemon is, I think, one of the very best examples of this, where as you progress through the story, you'll come across things that you can't get through, like little trees, or you'll see an island in the middle of the ocean that you can't get to because there's no boat or you don't have anything that can get over to it. But then eventually you'll find what are called HMs. Don't ask me what that stands for. I don't remember. But essentially it makes it so you can teach your little Pokemon to cut down trees, or surf, which lets you actually surf on them and get to new areas. And most RPGs have that kind of, where eventually you'll either start out with an ability or you'll get an ability at a certain point that allows you to progress to places that you couldn't have gone before.
Those outside combat abilities are sometimes what makes a game good. Obviously, other pieces of the game need to be solid for people to enjoy them, but sometimes the defining factor, the thing that really makes people remember it, are those interactions outside of combat. So it's a pretty significant portion of the game that you can really consider when you're looking at what you think is fun. The final tenet that really determines whether it is an RPG or not is the existence of character classes. Now, this, not so recently, has been deconstructed. A good 20 years ago, they started messing with this idea of forcing you to have a character of a specific class, and rather allowed you to do whatever it is that you want with your characters. Which really boils down to you can pick the class that they kind of spec into, whether they're going to be, the DPS, the person who really hits hard and does a lot of damage, whether they're a thief, being able to steal, whether they're the mage, being able to do magic attacks, or the white mage, who is a character that heals the rest of the party. A lot of that liberty has been given to the player in a lot of more mainstream RPGs, but the fact that they exist and the fact that you are kind of forced to pick what your characters will specialize in is kind of the main purpose of this tenet of you cannot have a character that does everything, at least not right away. Some games let you get to that point eventually, but most games will give you a certain number of party members, and each one will have their pros and cons that allow you to spec your team to take on whatever adversary comes your way.
Yeah, I think a interesting example of kind of this breaking the mold that you're talking about is there's a series of games that are based on not telling you what to do, and it's called Bravely Default, where you can give every single character you come across, you can give them specific jobs that will make them proficient in certain elements of the game, whether you want them to be a thief, a healer, a tank, a knight, like somebody who's really skilled with healing or sorry, black magic like fire, lightning, aggressive magic, those kinds of things. So if I understand correctly, you could conceivably make everybody good at the same thing. Why you do that, I don't know, but they do offer that kind of freedom to the player.
I mean, you could do that because you think it's cool. It's probably just going to screw you over later on when you're trying to take on someone that you just can't because you don't have the right skills. Another thing that tends to define RPGs, but this one is much more wishy-washy. It's not always true, and it doesn't require this to even be a good RPG, but most RPGs require that you use some good forethought and some good tactics during combat to defeat your enemies. For example, if you are playing a game and you happen to be in an area that is full of ice, you are likely to encounter enemies that use ice magic or are immune to ice magic because they live in a place where it's already freezing. They have evolved, or at least been designed to not have that kind of weakness. So you, as a smart player, need to be like, okay, well, if ice isn't going to work, they're probably weak to fire. And then you use fire on them, you do additional damage, and it's great. Not every RPG has this kind of being able to take advantage of weaknesses. There's even some really good RPGs that don't really have this. They don't tend to be very mainstream. But that is another kind of core idea, is that the reason the gameplay is interesting is because you have to think about it. It's not something that you can just go into, pick whatever you want, and win. You really have to plan out. And that's why there's very few people that tend to, if they have the ability, just pick all of the same character class. And it's because each character class is good at a specific thing. And if you don't have a well-rounded party, you are eventually going to run into a skill check for a skill that you don't have, and you're gonna fail hardcore.
Yeah, I think so a couple of, it's really a spectrum, like you said. Not all games do it, but some lean really, really heavily into it. Again, Pokemon, really good example of this, where essentially if you want to be really successful at the game and not have kind of a hard time and have to level up your Pokemon a whole lot to beat the bosses in the game, it's basically an advanced game of rock, paper, scissors, where you need to have the right Pokemon that have an elemental advantage over the gym leader's Pokemon. And the same is true in Persona 5, where if you want to be successful in the game, you have to hit the weaknesses of the enemies and kind of knock them down so that you can get really strong attacks onto them. Otherwise, every enemy can kick your butt, essentially, as you're gonna have a really, really hard time in some RPGs if you're not clued into this system of going against enemies' weaknesses. And like Jordan said, in other RPGs, you don't have to focus on that nearly as much, and you can just kind of power through.
I mean, a good example of that is the Final Fantasy series. The Final Fantasy series as a whole is very well regarded and generally really fun games. But there are a number of Final Fantasy games where you don't really have to be too concerned with an enemy's weakness. As long as you have leveled your characters high enough, or have enough potions or whatever, you can make it through any fight, no problem. Being able to exploit a weakness will make things easier, but it's almost never required. Whereas other games, such as Dragon Quest, if you aren't picking up on how to deal damage effectively to enemies, even the regular enemies that spawn in the world can and will kill you. And that's really bad in Dragon Quest, because in Dragon Quest, when a character dies, they stay dead for a very long time. And it's a bummer.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting, the whole idea of this podcast that we're doing today and kind of the series that we have going on is finding the fun. And I think one of the things that makes RPGs fun is kind of goes along with what we're talking about. There's one for everybody. If you want something that you can pretty easily figure it out and it's more story based And as long as you know kind of what you're doing, if you understand the weakness system, you'll be able to progress really easily. Things like Pokemon and Persona 5 are pretty good. Persona 5 has a really heavy story. Not heavy story, is heavily story focused. So if you like that, that's a really good one. Pokemon is a little bit less story focused, but every game does have kind of a main story that you can follow, and it leans really heavily into that weakness. So that the weakness system, that's another good one. But if that's not really your thing, Final Fantasy might be a better way to go. But I think most people could find one because it's such a wide spectrum of, RPG game developers who make RPGs can do whatever they want, and there's a huge variety in the types of RPGs and the kind of stories they deal with, the kind of gameplay mechanics they have, that I think there really is something out there for anyone who is interested in playing games to find something that they really enjoy.
Right. And speaking of finding the fun, I think now is a good time to start delving into a couple of series and a couple of specific games and talking about why this type of game is fun. I can imagine a lot of people who are unfamiliar with RPGs or just have never really given them a shot probably heard about the menu-based combat system and thought, how could that possibly be fun? Especially if you're the kind of person who really likes action and really likes to be pushed to the brink and likes to feel the visceral feeling of victory because you beat someone. How could you possibly have that in an RPG? And honestly, perhaps you won't ever get that feeling from an RPG. Just because we find it enjoyable and lots of other people find it enjoyable does not mean you will. And that isn't a bad thing. Some people like steak, some people like salad, some people like fish, other people hate all three of those things. So there's nothing wrong with any of that. It's just different flavors for different people. But now we want to kind of go into and talk about some games that really highlight some of these tenets and really make the game fun by focusing on one, multiple, or all of these.
I think just to kind of address what you just said, I was definitely one of those people. When I was younger, I saw, my older brothers would play these RPGs, and I wasn't really into them because, the menu system wasn't that engaging for me. But what I realized after watching and playing more myself is that what kind of redeemed it for me was the spectacle that went along with battles in RPGs. A really good example of this is Final Fantasy VI. Spoilers for a over 2-decade-old game, I guess. But you get to what a lot of people would think is the final boss, and you totally lose, and the world gets literally blown up. And that kind of stuff happens in RPGs a lot, where these just massive cataclysmic events happen, and you're like, whoa, I was not expecting that. And those kinds of things sometimes happen in battles. I mean, there's a fight scene, or there's a cinematic for a move in Final Fantasy VII where this planet just I think it's correct me if I'm wrong, but a meteor goes through this planet and the whole planet just explodes just for this one move. It's not even a cinematic in the game. It's a cinematic they made specifically just for a move that you can do during a battle.
You're talking about Supernova.
Yes. And things like that just really draw me in. I really like the cinematic flavor that most of these RPGs have, even sometimes just in regular battles.
Right, and I would chalk that up to kind of the story, because a lot of RPGs, to make up for the lack of, action in the core gameplay, really lean on the story being very exciting to grab people's attention. One of my favorite RPGs of all time is Final Fantasy IX. I'm sure there's a lot of people who agree with me and a lot of other people who absolutely do not agree with me. Final Fantasy IX is a good example of how slow a battle system can be in an RPG. This is because First of all, it's a menu-based system, so it takes a while. Second of all, while the game generally ran at about 24 frames per second, the battles ran at 15 frames per second. Now, this didn't lead to it looking super jittery or anything like that, but it did lead to the timing just taking an extra long amount of time for you to even get the opportunity to act. Once you chose the action that you wanted your character to engage in, they had a certain amount of time that they had to wait before they could actually use it. Now, in spite of this slowness, the spectacle of the game is fantastic. In the first couple of hours of the game, you go on a quest to kidnap a princess in a flying ship. The flying ship has massive harpoon chains stabbed into it as you're trying to escape. Then a giant bomb gets thrown at you. But in the Final Fantasy world, rather than the bomb being a big cannon, it's a monster that you have to fight. And when you fail to defeat it, it blows up and destroys the back half of your ship, and it crashes into a cursed forest. Right after that happens, certain characters from your party are kidnapped by creatures in the forest that you have to then go hunt down. In the process of doing this, you also find a giant plant monster that tries to kill you and your friends. When you defeat it, the entire forest starts to petrify and you have to run for your life out of it. And so, it's just spectacle event after spectacle event after spectacle event. And it's very high octane action that is in direct opposition of the speed of the actual gameplay. But because of that kind of dichotomy, you really get the highs from those cinematics in the story of like, wow, my blood is pumping right now because like, what's going to happen next? If this is how the game starts, then how is it going to end? Because if you're unfamiliar with Final Fantasy always has a ludicrous ending.
Yeah, Final Fantasy IX definitely has the most engaging beginning of any of the RPGs any of the RPGs that I've played. It's very interesting. But yeah, I think the stories, like you said, a lot of time the story events play into the spectacle. Final Fantasy X has another good example of this, where summons are not introduced. Okay, wait, hold on. Summons are a somewhat common thing in RPGs. Not all of them have them, but most Final Fantasies have them, and a lot of other RPGs have borrowed that idea, where essentially certain characters can summon these ginormous, generally like monsters or demons or demigods that will then fight for you and usually are very, very, very powerful. In Final Fantasy X, there's a whole kind of like side story about one of these summons, and the cutscene where you see it, it's just like ginormous. It comes out, and later on when you get these other summons, you don't just use the summon for one move. You actually stop controlling your whole party of teammates for a little bit, and you just control this summon, and every single move is a spectacle. And it's a big part of the story are these summons that you can do. So I think you're definitely right that the story elements kind of play into that spectacle and make them even more satisfying, because it's not just spectacle for the sake of spectacle. It's these awesome events that are actually playing into the story itself, and you understand the purpose behind all these things that are happening.
Right, and I think that really game designers have discovered that one of the big selling points of RPGs is the spectacle events, because I've seen that games, at least more recent games, that don't have that kind of spectacle in their battles and their stories tend to have something else in it to make it interesting. One example of a game that does not really have this spectacle would be Earthbound. Earthbound was a game that came out on the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, so it didn't really have the same bandwidth or the spectacle that some games have. But even more so, in a lot of RPGs, especially current RPGs, when you input a command, you will see at least a representation of your characters follow through with that action. In the Mother series, which Earthbound is a part of, that does not happen. You see a still portrait of the enemy, and you sometimes see a minor effect flash up on screen to let you know that something hit. But for the most part, what happens is you input a command, and then you just have a readout of how much damage you did and whether you killed the enemy or not, and then what they did back to you. The reason that Earthbound could get away with this is, one, Dragon Quest, when it first came out, also had the same kind of system. So people were kind of used to it. The whole spectacle piece of it hadn't really come out yet. And the game is funny. The character designs are often very odd. The enemies you actually fight are often very strange. For example, some of the first enemies you fight are ants, and they're just like really big ants that you fight. And unfortunately, they're also like really strong when you first start, so you can get your butt handed to you by an ant, and it's ridiculous. It's hilarious. So in spite of not having a visually engaging combat system, the fact that it was so funny and that the story was so interesting, it could kind of get around that. Nowadays, if you don't have some kind of spectacle with your combat system, you need to have something else. Otherwise, people are going to become disinterested. A good example of that would be Undertale, where its combat system starts as an RPG, where you have a menu-based system, and you just select what you want to do. But then during actual combat, it turns into a bullet hell / semi-platformer, depending on where you're at. Yeah. And it does that because the actual enemies tend to be just black and white silhouettes, and that's it. Sometimes it's much more interesting, but I can only really remember one or two fights that were more interesting than that. And so the designer of that game knew that if that's all he had, people weren't going to buy into it. So he needed to add some action into it to make it more interesting.
Yeah, you stole my thunder. I was going to talk about Undertale, but then you beat me to the punch. But I think, if we stay on that vein of things that Undertale does to set itself apart, Undertale is a wonderful example of a modern RPG kind of stretching the limits and just changing people's perspectives on what an RPG can be. Because to be honest, player choice has not played a major role in RPGs in the past. Sometimes you'd have dialogue options, but in general, you would get railroaded along the path you needed to follow, and any choices you make wouldn't have significant consequences. Undertale, on the other hand, has several different endings and has several different iterations on each of the major endings, all dependent on what you do throughout the game. Now, to be honest, your first playthrough is a little bit railroaded because if you do a single thing, you'll always get the same ending no matter what else you do throughout the rest of the game. But
not if you do a single thing, but rather if you do one of a plethora of choices, any one of them, without foreknowledge, you're going to be forced into this specific ending. So it's not just one thing or, a specific thing. There's a whole bunch of things that you can do, but until you complete the game, you don't know.
Right, exactly. But still, it was a very good step in the right direction of letting players kind of discover the world themselves and actually play, really role play and be able to make their own choices. And it kind of stretched the limits of games because in general, gamers don't expect their choices to make a huge difference unless they're specifically told what difference those choices are making, and they're told that their choices will make a difference kind of at the beginning. And I think that's something that, is really hard, obviously, to implement. Undertale is a fairly short game because it takes a lot of work to put in all those choices and the consequences of those choices. but it would make a game like Final Fantasy really interesting to have each player be able to make their own unique experience and have a lot more replay value, where you get to see a little bit, how would this story have played out had I chosen to spare this major enemy that I fought at a certain point, or if I had chosen to impersonate this guard and go, if you're faced with a choice of like infiltrating the ship as a guard or staying on the mainland and pursuing something else in the city, how does that change the story? And I think that's something that would be really interesting in the future.
Yeah, I think Undertale did do some really interesting things in that regard, but even it was severely limited. And the biggest issue I have in general with choices in video games is that the choices feel less... Choices in video games often railroad you into a very specific type of play or a specific type of decision, because more often than not, they are either binary or tertiary choices of you pick one of these two options, or if you flip-flop between the two, you get a third inferior option to both of these. I think eventually we'll talk a little bit more about that. But in general, even the games that are lauded for their ability to let you choose generally force you into playing a very specific way. For example, Undertale, the main endings that people talk about are either the pacifist ending, where you choose not to kill or hurt any enemy in the game, which you don't really learn that that's an option until after you finish the game. You don't really know that that's something that you can do for literally every enemy. Or there's the genocide option, where you kill literally every enemy in the game, and not just like every enemy you encounter. You have to search and destroy enemies. It's very grimdark. It's not very pleasant. The problem with this is that, as interesting as these two choices are, and as fun as it is to get to them, the gray area in between of killing, 1% to 99% of the monsters leads to the same outcome. And so my issue is that because of this system, and especially because that middle road outcome is empirically the worst, well, at least the most uninteresting. Genocide ending is definitely the worst ending.
Indeed.
But it's just the least interesting, and it's the least interesting to achieve. You are forced into either I will not kill anyone or I will kill everyone. I just think that the real power that video games have is within that gray area, is within that area of who did you choose to save? Who did you choose to kill? Why did you do those things? Why did you choose this course of action instead of this course of action in these circumstances? Now, just like Westin said, that's going to be tough to achieve. There's so much programming, and there's so many things that people will miss out because you're not railroaded into a specific type of decision. But if we could get to the point where that is what making choices in games was, man, that would be amazing. That would be just an amazing feat, and something that I would love to see the outcome of.
Yeah. And we could definitely do a whole episode about player choice in games. But I just wanted to mention one other example really quickly without delving deeply into it. But Chrono Trigger does that really, really well. It has, 27 different endings?
I think it's 35 with the new recent releases. I don't remember the exact number. It's a lot.
It's just ridiculous. And it all depends on what you choose to do throughout the game. And it depends on how there are options that are open to you from the very beginning that are super hard, but will give you a completely different ending than later on. But I think that's really where the strength of RPGs come in, you know, where one of the major things that makes RPGs fun is you pick up an RPG and there are things you expect to see, right? You expect to see, like you said, the 5 tenets of an RPG. You expect to have a really expansive story, or very, you know, a story with a lot of depth. You expect to see menu operated battles. You expect to, you know, in the majority of them, you expect to have magical elements that you can use. But every single time that you go into an RPG, you never know what your overall experience is going to be, rather, because it's a place for developers to take a lot of risks. They can do whatever they want within this world, and you get to experience it. Undertale took a lot of risks and changed how people think about player choice and how they think about, you know, what a good RPG is, because it didn't have the graphics, it didn't have the spectacle, and it, you know, but it did have a very, very intriguing new way of combat, and it had very interesting endings. And Persona 5 has a very interesting story where it's more like a visual novel than a traditional RPG, and it's just a place for developers to kind of have fun and experiment with these new ideas, and for the industry to really grow quite rapidly in new ideas.
Yeah, I think there's kind of 2 RPG series that are better known than any other as RPG series, and that's Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest. Over here in the US, there's far fewer fans of Dragon Quest, and part of that is due to the games just not being released here. There were, I think the 5th game was released in the US, and then the 8th game. And then finally you got 9, 10, and 11. But all the other ones didn't come out in the US for a long time, and it's because Japan decided that we just weren't into it, which, to be fair, we probably weren't. But Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest are both produced by Square Enix, and they have vastly different approaches to how they continue their mainline entries. Mainline entries meaning numbered entries. Dragon Quest 1, Dragon Quest 2, Dragon Quest 3, Final Fantasy 1, Final Fantasy 2, Final Fantasy 3, as opposed to spin-offs that happen every now and again that drastically change the way that the story is told or the way that you play the game, things like that. Final Fantasy has some core tenets that they never change, such as leveling up. Almost everything else has always changed. It's never the same characters, it's never the same ability system, and the story is always drastically different in a drastically different setting. The worlds are always different. Dragon Quest, each entry is very similar to the previous. The story is different, but the type of world that it's set in is almost exactly the same. It's not exactly the same, but it's the same kind of time setting. It's the same kind of magic and architecture and clothing. They have a lot of recurring themes that crop up, and you'll be able to find characters that fulfill that role every time. So Final Fantasy changes itself. Dragon Quest does not. That doesn't quite do justice to everything that the series kind of do to stay relevant and why they're so popular, but in general, that's kind of the easiest way to look at them. And it's interesting that both of them are so popular in spite of these major differences in how they continue kind of their lineage. Final Fantasy is by far one of the most well-known and highly regarded RPGs in the world. And it sells millions of copies for every game that releases. But as time has gone on, the game has become more and more action-oriented. From Final Fantasy 1 to Final Fantasy 9, it had the active time combat system, where you had a kind of bar that would fill up, And when that bar filled up all the way, you would be able to take your turn. And that bar would fill up independently for each character, and behind the scenes, there was a bar for the enemies. Once Final Fantasy not 10 rolled around, that bar was gone. And now every character and every enemy had instantaneous turns, but their turn order was determined by their speeds. And you would have a little list at the top of your screen that would let you know whose turn it was and whose turn would be next, up to, I think, 15 moves in advance, which really let you plan out what you were going to do. But it was still a stop and start system of you kind of had to wait, input what someone was going to do, and then go forward. Final Fantasy XI was an online MMORPG. We're not going to get into that, especially since it's much different from the other mainline entries. 12 is the next entry that kind of iterated on the design, and this one, you no longer went into a separate scene for combat. You no longer controlled all of your party members. You only controlled the main character. You could move during combat. And while they brought back the kind of ATB fill-up bar, they changed the way that you order your companions with what is called the Gambit system. I'm not going to get super deep into this, but essentially, outside of battle, you had a menu where you could tell your team members, this is the priority of events that I want you to follow. For example, number one priority, if there's someone on the team that has 30% or lower health, use a healing item on them or use a healing spell on them. If that condition has not been met, then the next most pressing thing is I want you to attack physically the closest enemy to you or the strongest enemy or whatever. In this way, you still had a lot of strategy in the system, but the game moved much more quickly. It was much more action-focused. Next in the series was Final Fantasy XIII, which kept that kind of Gambit system, but no longer let you refine it and tweak it. Instead, it had a predefined list of roles, and you could pick a subset of roles for each character and say, I want this character to be the attacker, this character to be the defender, and this character to be the red mage, the person who inflicts status ailments on the enemy. Or I want everyone to attack, or I want a healer, or whatever. And so you were removed once again from the planning stages, and it became much faster action and much more action focused. 14 in the series again was an MMORPG. Skip over that one, and finally brings us to Final Fantasy 15, the latest in the series, which is all action all the time. There is a menu system, but you generally don't use it. You can switch to using a menu system all the time, but really that's not the purpose of the way the game was designed. The game was designed for you to, in real time, press buttons and use abilities in that fashion.
Yeah, I was just gonna say Final Fantasy is a very good, example of that kind of taking risks and seeing what works and seeing what doesn't. And sometimes people really like the changes that they have made, and sometimes they don't land well at all. But it's But Final Fantasy, still as a series, is popular because even though it takes risks, they kind of learn, when people respond badly to a certain system, generally you don't really have to worry about that system necessarily being in the next one because they change stuff all the time. If you didn't like the story in one Final Fantasy, and you didn't like the setting, whatever, that's fine. You'll play the next one and it might be something you're a lot more interested in. So that kind of goes back to the flexibility of RPGs to kind of appeal to a really, really wide audience. Everyone can kind of find something to like.
Right, and Final Fantasy especially is kind of the broad audience appeal is what they're going for. On the flip side, Dragon Quest, from 1 to 11, it is a standard You input what you want your characters to do, and then they do it. And that has not changed. The visual style has changed, and the spectacle has increased from iteration to iteration. But the way that you play the game has not really changed ever since it began. And it's a much slower system. It's very interesting because in Final Fantasy, I mentioned it's got the active time battle where a bar fills up and then it's your turn. In Dragon Quest, every turn starts the same. You have your swath of characters that you've put into your party. You tell each one, based on party order, what you want them to do in that round. And then you and the enemies take turns based on your speed and a behind-the-scenes speed roll to decide who goes first, who goes second, who goes third. So before each round begins, you don't know who in your party is going to go first and who is going to go last, and you don't know when the enemies are going to attack. So it's definitely a much more methodical, you really have to think ahead, as opposed to Final Fantasy. Not to say that Final Fantasy, is dumber or anything, but it's much different the manner in which you need to plan. On top of that, Final Fantasy tends to be fairly straightforward in that you don't need to do too much grinding. Grinding, if you're unfamiliar, is the idea of fighting normal enemies to increase your player's statistics. If you grind for long enough, in most games, you will get strong enough that it doesn't really matter if you're good at the game or not. You can just defeat the enemies because you're such a higher level than they are. Final Fantasy, generally you can go through the game just going from point A to point B, following along with the story, and you'll be strong enough to face everything that you encounter no problem. Dragon Quest, that is absolutely not the case. If you just go from point A to point B, you'll be like half the level that you're supposed to be. The way they make up for this is making every battle a little bit more tense, a little bit more interesting, if you're interested in that type of gameplay. And they also have a lot of exploration that leads into other skills and other factors of the story to encourage you to not just walk in circles to try to fight enemies, but to actually progress and do interesting things so that you are prepared for the next encounter.
Yeah, I think we've talked about a lot of things that make RPGs good, why they are such a popular type of game. But to kind of lead into our final point that we wanted to address today, I think a natural question that may come up, especially as we've been talking about the 5 core tenets, would be, okay, but like, why, right? Because we've talked about some of the games that have stretched these, like Bravely Default with the jobs, so that people aren't set classes, that you can choose who is your wizard and your thief and your knight. And we've talked about games that don't have as central of a storyline and focus a lot more on gameplay. But there are some RPGs that take risks and change this formula, and it does not work out. And you can kind of learn lessons from them about what are central to RPGs and what are things that you can maybe stretch the limits of. One example of this would be Paper Mario Sticker Star. The Paper Mario series is not at all like the regular Mario series. Every Paper Mario is an RPG where you play as a paper version of Mario, and there's usually a lot stronger of a story, and you meet a lot more diverse characters than you would in the normal games. But the thing that, and Sticker Star does all of this, but the one thing they don't do is they get rid of leveling. Instead, you don't have basic attacks that you can level up and will do more damage, and you don't have magical attacks that will do more damage as you level up. Instead, you collect stickers throughout the game, and the stickers do set amounts of damage, and they have set statistics. So, the problem that arises from this, it's an interesting concept, But the problem is that you can see the enemies that you will fight and you can walk around them. And so, as you're collecting these stickers, if there's no leveling up, you have no incentive to fight the normal enemies to get experience to level up. In fact, if you fight normal enemies, you might end up just wasting good stickers that you could be saving for boss battles that you have to do later on. And so, it's just not good design, because a game should not be incentivizing you, especially an RPG, should not be incentivizing you to just run past all of the enemies that you encounter because you get no reward. There's literally no point in fighting lower level enemies because there is no reward. There's no incentive to do it.
There's an entire genre of games called stealth games where the point is to avoid confrontation and not encounter enemies. RPGs are not stealth games. So if you're playing an RPG and you're like, oh, I should avoid all the enemies because it's either boring to fight them or there's no real reason to fight them, then you're doing something significantly wrong in your game.
Yeah. Do you have any other examples of, I don't know, times that maybe RPGs have done a misstep, in your opinion? Any kind of worse RPGs and why?
You know, I think Final Fantasy is a good example of this for personal reasons. Every person who is engaged in the Final Fantasy games has played multiples will have one that is their favorite and one that is not their favorite. And they'll have different reasons as to why. One of my favorite / least favorite games is Final Fantasy VIII. It started out as one of my least favorite Final Fantasies because its game systems were not explained very well, and so it was very difficult to make progress. Once I learned how to effectively utilize those systems, I was able to absolutely smash every enemy in the game without any problem, which is a balancing issue, and that has some other problems with it. But the reason that RPGs are fun for me is twofold. One, I enjoy stories, especially stories that are very grandiose and very bombastic, and that have interesting characters. Every Final Fantasy essentially has ticked that box, so I always enjoy that. The other thing that I really enjoy from RPGs is being able to plan ahead and outfit my team with exactly what they need to crush whatever enemy is coming my way. I love being able to plan ahead and be like, this enemy uses fire damage. Well, I'm going to throw on some armor that not only defends against fire, but absorbs it to heal my character. So I love the feeling of vanquishing an enemy because I am more technically capable than they are. I also love action games, but for RPGs, there's a certain feeling of being able to plan ahead and for hours and hours and hours put into place different steps to ensure that your party is as strong as possible for whatever comes up.
Interesting. Yeah, I think, I don't know. I mean, there's just, again, I think it all comes back to RPGs are super flexible. You know, everybody can find things that they'll like in them. And there are some, like I mentioned with like Sticker Star, there are some pretty essential things to RPGs that if you're missing them, they're probably not going to do as well, and they're going to be regarded as kind of missteps by the developer. But RPGs are just a super interesting game genre, and they're so expansive that, you know, there's lots of things that we definitely did not cover. And if you have any thoughts about anything we've talked about today, we'd love for you to reflect with us and send us your thoughts to reflectionsongaming@gmail.com. We'd love to read them, tell us we're wrong, agree with us, whatever. We're open to criticisms and welcome agreement. So we'd just love to hear from you. So please send in any thoughts that you have.
That's right. The most important thing about this is that everything we say, well, not everything, but most of what we say is our opinion. So The more opinions, the better the discussion can be. Speaking of opinions, if you have any interest after hearing us talk for so long about RPGs and actually testing one out and seeing if you too can enjoy RPGs, we want to give you a list of a couple of RPGs that might be good for getting into. The first set of RPGs that you could try out is Pokemon. Pokemon is the most popular RPG franchise in the world. However, there are some caveats to trying Pokemon. If you want to try Pokemon, you have to be okay with a very bare bones story. Very frequently, a lot of hand-holding, explaining everything, which if you're new to RPGs isn't necessarily a bad thing. It is generally not very difficult, and there is a lot of grinding involved. So you have to be okay with a cutesy story, and you have to really love the design of Pokemon creatures. Otherwise, you might find it becoming boring very quickly, because there are hundreds of Pokemon that you can capture throughout the game, and you will be building a team of 6. As you capture new Pokemon, they will be generally weaker than the Pokemon you have in your party. So to remain competitive in the game, you'll have to fight a whole bunch of random battles to get those new Pokemon strong enough to, face enemies in your team. So just be wary of that.
If that doesn't really sound like it's up your alley, depending on what you're looking for, if you're looking for amazing spectacle and very realistic graphics, along with a very good story, one of the newer Final Fantasies, especially the Final Fantasy VII remake that just dropped a couple months ago, would be a really great intro. Or if you're looking for a more traditional RPG experience, Dragon Quest is another really good series that it would be good to dip your toes in with. It's a lot more difficult than Pokemon will be, but it's a lot more of a traditional outline of an RPG, and it'll kind of give you a good sense of what to expect in the future.
Yeah, if you do choose to play Resident Evil Final Fantasy VII Remake, know that it has much more action than most RPGs. It has an action focus in the battles where you will fight enemies with regular attacks to fill up your action gauge, and then you'll be able to unleash really powerful abilities. You can switch it to pure RPG mode, but really that just kind of takes some of the combat out of your hands. But if that sounds appeasing to you, go for it. It's a beautiful game, has a very engaging story. It's a lot of fun. Dragon Quest XI, due to the person who makes the music is beautiful, but you won't hear that beauty depending on what platform you play it on. So if you do choose to get Dragon Quest, specifically 11, the newest one that has come out, try to get it for either PC or get it on the Nintendo Switch. And this is because on the PC, there's a mod that lets you put in the symphonic music. The Switch version automatically has that, whereas the PlayStation and the Xbox version have MIDI music, which is not nearly as nice to listen to.
That's so interesting. Last thing I'll say, if you're looking for a less traditional experience and something that maybe stretches the RPG genre, Undertale is a great game, and its follow-up, Deltarune Chapter 1, also very interesting. And the Paper Mario series and all the Mario RPGs are, for the most part, excepting Sticker Star, are very well made and very entertaining, and are very interesting, and each one kind of changes up the gameplay a little. So
I think I'll say definitively, if you want an RPG in its truest form that is easy for newcomers to get into, as long as you're okay with retro graphics, play Chrono Trigger. You can get it on just about every platform ever. Just that is a quintessential RPG. It's easy to pick up, it explains itself well, and it is one of the highest regarded RPGs of all time for good reason. So if you want to get into it and none of the other choices we gave you are making sense or piquing your interest, try Chrono Trigger.
Yeah. We really appreciate you listening to this podcast, and we hope you enjoyed it. If you did enjoy it, please leave a rating. And if you really enjoyed it, please leave a review on the podcast center of your choice. It really helps spread the podcast and really helps us to reach a wider audience. And if this is the first one you've listened to, go listen to some of our backlog. And we hope that we can keep having you around and listen to our podcast in the future.
And with that, we hope you've enjoyed it and hope you come back next time.
Bye.